Good morning, guys. My name's James White. I'm the Managing Director of Media First. Welcome to what is the second in a series of webinars that we're doing over the next 12 months. The events have proved very popular. The first session that we did was with the Comms Director of British Medical Association. And in fact, we did that fatal thing of not coming with any preloaded questions and thinking it'll be fine. People are going to ask loads of questions. And guess what? We were right. We had so many questions that we completely failed to allow enough time for Helen to be able to answer them. And in fact, had to go back and record a follow-up webinar with her just as a Q&A because we had sort of 60, 70 questions that we needed to get through. So thank you very much to all of those guys who were on that last webinar and who helped us make it as interactive as we did. I know there are lots of new faces on this webinar, so please just kind of follow their lead. There should be a questions box on the right-hand side. And if you ask questions in there, then we can upvote them. Or even if you don't ask questions, you can go in there, you can click to like that question, and that will just move it up the list so that it's more likely to be answered. So make it as interactive as possible. This is really all about you guys and kind of creating an environment where we can discuss lots of different topics on these webinars. So this particular webinar is building relationships with journalists, obviously in a changing media landscape as we're in at the moment. The event today is being hosted by Chris Maughan. Chris is a familiar face on ITV News, particularly down here in the South. And Chris is also a fantastic media trainer. So for those of you who don't know about Media First, that's something you should know, is that we do a lot of media training here. It's probably 90% of the work that we do, but we also do message development, crisis management, and presentation skills, as well as social media training and how to film and edit and all sorts of things like that. So anything really that can support a comms or a media team in-house, that's the type of work that we specialize in and have been doing now for just over 40 years. Chris today is going to be joined by Sean Ryan. Sean is currently Comms Director of Save the Children. Previous to that, he was editor of many national newspapers, including the Sunday Times and the Mail. Sean's an incredibly charming, articulate, and just a clever, decent guy, as Chris is too. I should have said that about Chris. But yeah, a lot of love for both of those guys. So thanks very much for joining us. We're also joined by Louise Lee, who is the Senior Media Officer from Blue Cross. And Louise is going to be just jumping in to talk about how they have built relationships with journalists, as part of their charity. So, as I say, keep it as interactive as possible. I hope you enjoy it. If you didn't manage to watch it live, you will be able to download it afterwards. So if you do need to dip out, that's absolutely cool. Jump onto the website, mediafirst.co.uk, and have a look at the download section at the top, and you'll find loads of other ebooks and blogs and videos and webinars like this that you can go and get your teeth into. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Chris to the stage, and Chris will take over proceedings. Morning, Chris.
Morning, James. I'm just making sure my microphone is on. I'm just thinking to myself that even in this era of remote, distant online working, we're using this incredible technology and keeping our fingers crossed that it will work. But having said that, I have to say that I still do sincerely believe that relationships really do matter, whether from a journalistic perspective or even if you're on the comms or PR side of that particular sort of negotiation or transaction. Because even if you are looking for positive media outlets, you want those contacts. You might be trying to promote an event or a particular story or a product. Or even if you're in a more defensive, negative scenario where perhaps you fear that the media might come calling, you still want to have those relationships, don't you? So that you can try at least to see if you can influence the media agenda. So thanks very much indeed for that introduction. I actually started on the print side of the industry. I worked for an agency on the South Coast, submitting material to the national newspapers. and we were always pitching stories. We were looking for fresh content, and we were hoping that that content would resonate, particularly with audiences, so that it would work. And of course, in this current era with social media, there are so many platforms from which news can appear. But really, from the journalistic perspective, we always want it to be fresh, new, offer something a little bit different, and as I say, hopefully resonate with the audience. And then it all comes back really to people. And even in our media training courses, we speak so much about the importance of human interest. And that's why these personal relationships really do matter. So as you say, James, a little bit later, I'm looking forward to speaking to Louise Lee. Louise, I've worked with on numerous occasions, as you say, is a senior media officer with the animal welfare charity Blue Cross. So we'll speak to Louise. But first, I'm going to bring in my good friend and colleague, Sean Ryan. Sean, as you said, James, is Director of Communications at Save the Children, a global charity supporting children. It's fair to say, Sean, often in dire and extreme circumstances. And I'm sure that we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I know that you can also offer a valuable insight from the perspective of the media. James referenced the fact there that you've worked for several national newspapers. I know you started with a provincial newspaper as well. It's also fair to say, Sean, and quite a few people may not know this, that your illustrious career carried you into film, did it not? Because I'm going to pose the question, what does Sean Ryan here, who we can see on our screen, George V and the spy Guy Burgess all have in common? It's a bit of a different question, isn't it? So Sean, do you want to answer that one?
The answer is that we've all been played by tiny Tom Hollander, a very good actor. I was foreign editor at the Sunday Times when a star correspondent called Marie Colvin was tragically killed in Syria. And a Hollywood movie was made of Marie's life and death. So Rosamund Pike played Marie and got a Golden Globe nomination for it. And I was played by Tom Hollander, who took me out to dinner before shooting his scenes because he wanted a few insights into my relationship with Marie, and he wanted to know how things worked in a newsroom. And at the end, he said, how do you really feel about being portrayed on the big screen? And I said, well, obviously, I feel really apprehensive. He said, don't worry, I'll play you with love and compassion. And when I bumped into him at a party a month later after he'd shot his scenes and said, well, how did the filming go? He said, look, I'm really sorry, Sean. In the end, it was just easier to play you as a pushy dick. So if you ever go and see a film called A Private War, then that's what you'll see.
Interesting, Sean, that you're now going to these showbiz parties. And I don't think he was cast, was he, because of his stature, because you're 6 feet tall plus.
He comes up to my hips.
Let's talk about the media and journalism. You had numerous, before you became foreign editor at the Sunday Times, you had numerous reporting roles. How important was it for you to have good contacts? And I'm thinking to myself that, you know, it would have landed you stories. It may even have landed you some of your journalistic roles.
Yes. Good contacts are essential to any journalist. They're everything. They're the difference between churning out bland stories based on just what you can find online and breaking original, fresh stories with a bit of colour. So I tend to categorize contacts into 3 levels. There are the ones who give you scoops, who deserve to be taken out for lunch on expenses. And then there are the ones who have expertise and can give you a bit of a steer and some insight. And then there are the ones who you can go to for a reaction or a comment. But obviously, everyone's favorite contacts are the ones who give you scoops. So just one example of a contact I really cultivated. When I was environment correspondent at the Sunday Times, I saw that Friends of the Earth were breaking a lot of very interesting stories. So I got to know their campaigns director. I even had him to stay at my house. And he eventually told me that there was a chemical company on the Cumbrian coast that was discharging illegal levels of pollution into the sea. And the interesting thing about it was that the board directors included the shadow environment secretary, Jack Cunningham, at the time. So we decided that we would go and take our own samples from the effluent pipe at the back of the plant. And it was plant that was built on a lot of rocks, so we had to clamber over huge boulders for about half a mile to get there. And then the effluent was pouring into the sea in great clouds of steam. We were in hazmat suits, white suits that were very photogenic, and we collected our samples, and we found that there were highly illegal levels of radiation and heavy metals, and it turned out it was just as well that we'd worn the hazmat suits, even though they were probably more for photographic effect than anything at the time. And I was at the Daily Mail, actually at the time, not the Sunday Times, as environment correspondent then, and they ran a big front page headline, Labour's Dr. Green in Poison Sea row. And that was a lovely story. It was a very well followed story, and it got me my job at the Sunday Times, because when the Sunday Times saw that, they thought they would like to have.
Yeah, so it did.
And they asked me in. Yeah,
it landed you a role, and I think it's fair to say, Sean, isn't it, that that you had a particular full story on that occasion, but also as journalists, we also need to know where the experts are, don't we? There are occasions when we're thinking, okay, this particular organisation has an expertise in this particular sector, and we know they will assist us. We know they can be helpful. So let's pick up the phone or email these particular people because we'll get a response. Is that fair as well?
Yeah, so one of my jobs was science editor at the Sunday Times, which I was way out of my depth to do because I just about scraped a grade B in physics GCSE and I had no scientific qualifications. Also, my brief was everything from food safety to polar exploration. So I knew a little about a lot, but I didn't know much about anything really. So I relied on the university press offices. If I was writing about genomics for the first time, for example, I would just ring up somebody at Cambridge and ask them to put me in touch with somebody who would talk me through. And it was very helpful to have those conversations because they could often correct a misapprehension, but they could also say, actually, you're missing the big story here. It's such and such rather than what you think it is. So I was always very grateful for those steers and always then go back to that person that I've been put in touch with through the university press office.
Yeah, and I know on occasion some of us as journalists, we speak to each other and we have these conversations that we almost accept that there's a transaction going on, isn't there? And that on occasions our contacts may be trying to ingratiate themselves with us as journalists because we have contacts within the media. And in a sense, we're prepared to accept that, aren't we? That yes, the contact, they also want something from this relationship.
I don't regard it as ingratiating themselves. And I hope that's not what I'm doing now that I'm on the other side of the fence. But it is, as you say, a transaction. So if somebody's got a story to sell and I want to buy as an editor or a reporter, then we're both happy. And if I don't want it, then they'll move on, find somebody else maybe, and there's no harm done. So I think we just have to be quite clinical about this process. If you take rejection personally, you might be in the wrong job because I think communications people have to take a lot of rejection. I'm certainly taking a lot of rejection now myself at Save the Children when I think something's fascinating and editors and reporters don't agree. So I think we just have to try and make the story as appealing as we can to the reporter or the media outlet. And that is a bit of an art because it requires you to target the right stories to the right media. And to really pitch successfully, you need to understand a reporter's audience. So it's no good pitching a story to the Times about something in Sheffield with very little national appeal that will sit very comfortably in the Sheffield Star. And it's no good pitching to the Daily Mail a highly technical story that will sit better in a specialist outlet. And it's a good pitch, I think, to a reporter to say, I've noticed you've been writing about X and Y, and I think I've got something you might be interested in. So it's sort of flattering to the reporter that you've read their work, and it means that you're not just cold calling a dozen people with the same story, that you've actually put some thought into why you think this story would appeal to that outlet. And I think that makes the story much more likely to be taken.
And once again, perhaps even from the media perspective, what would you say to your colleagues now in corporate communications, press officers, public relations organisations, some of whom may be with us on this call today? What would you say to them about trust as a journalist? Can they trust us? Well,
trust is a mutual thing. And it's got to work both ways, and it's got to be built up through trial and error. So if somebody comes to me as a reporter and gives me a good story and the information is accurate and it's not spun out of all proportion, then I will trust that person the next time they contact me. If they come to me with false information or a story that is overly spun, I might not take the call next time round. So I think it's important to build trust through bringing people good stories that you know that their publication and that particular journalist will be interested in. And if it works, if a story works for both of you, you've got the basis of a good relationship. But of course, things can go wrong, and always inevitably do go wrong at various points, because you might work with a reporter on a story that is perfect for your chief executive, and then you find that it's been dropped from the paper at the last minute within an hour of deadline, and you've had no warning except to pick up the paper or look at it online and it's not there. Or the key paragraph that you wanted to include might be cut by one of these annoying people called sub-editors, whose job is to make the story fit the space it's been given on a page. Or the reporter might make a mistake. And reporters make lots of mistakes because they work very fast and often don't have the time to check as they probably should. At least that's their excuse. And so it might be that you have to explain to one of your colleagues why a reputable paper got a story not completely wrong, but why there was an error in it. So you have to live with the ups and downs, because that's journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And in an era, I'm just also thinking that this is an era when many big organizations hide, almost, they appear to hide behind automated telephone systems. It can actually be quite challenging, can't it, for those on the outside to know how and how they reach the contact that will be right for that particular person. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think people have trouble reaching me, because they can DM me on Twitter, and they can send me a message on LinkedIn, and this goes for every journalist really. They can email me, because my email address is gettable through LinkedIn, and although I don't read all my emails because there are too many to open, I will probably read something that I've had a little warning is coming if I've had a message about it first. And then if I have read it and if I'm interested, I'll contact them. They don't necessarily need to contact me, but it is possible to get through. I mean, I think hundreds of people have got my mobile number, and probably the mobile numbers of many journalists. And I tend not to answer the phone if it's a number I don't recognize. I'll only pick it up if it comes up with a name, because I've put the person in my phone, and I'll only put them in my phone if we've worked on a story together and they've given me a good story or a good steer and become one of my trusted contacts. Yeah,
and we began this conversation speaking about your work as foreign editor at the Sunday Times, the Marie Colvin story. I'm just wondering, when you moved into that role, obviously quite a contrast to sort of domestic news. You had a global reach, if you like. Did that change the nature and the way you dealt with your contacts?
My editor expected me to know what ministers were thinking about different issues, so I would have to know ministers. I would go to Foreign Office drinks, or maybe get one of them out to lunch if I was lucky enough to do that. I would have to be able to speak to senior officials who were the real experts. I mean, they know a lot about the running stories of the day. I would have to know people in intelligence. I would have to know lots of freelance journalists in places where I couldn't get a member of staff to, so that I could still commission good content. And increasingly, I'd be interested in people who could take pictures and get video as well. But I suppose more than anything, as foreign editor, I was dependent on my correspondence contacts, and it was quite remarkable how some of them produced extraordinary stories. So I don't know if you remember, quite a long time ago, there was a big siege at a theatre in Moscow where Chechen rebels took over the theatre and held the entire audience hostage. And my Moscow correspondent knew somebody in the audience. He just happened to know him. The guy had his phone with him. So my correspondent rang him up, and he got a nice bit of colour about the scene inside the theatre. But then my correspondent said, I'd really like to come in and interview the head of the hostage takers. What do you think? So the phone was handed to one of the terrorists, who handed it to the head of the hostage takers, and he agreed to be interviewed. And that was all down to having one contact in the theatre. But there was another key contact, and that was that the Moscow correspondent knew somebody very senior in the Russian security apparatus who approved the idea of the reporter going in, because he knew that that would garner intelligence. The reporter would be able to say what the conditions were like and how many terrorists there were and what sort of weapons they were carrying and all the rest of it. So the reporter went in, did this remarkable interview, and not only that, but he came out with a British hostage who had a heart condition and managed to make a case to be allowed out and given medical treatment. Another
good story, yeah, for you at the Sunday Times. Interesting. And as James rejoins us, very interesting. Thanks very much indeed for that, Sean. James?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, Chris. Lots of questions coming in already, so I just thought we'd jump in and let's try and get through some of these, if that's okay with you guys. There's a question here from Debbie. Is there still a place for the press release? And that's been upvoted 16 times, so there's obviously quite a bit of appetite for that question. What do we think, guys? Press release still relevant?
Well, as a reporter, I tended not to read very many press releases, but if there was a story I was interested in and somebody had a press release to send me with the basic information and a comment in it, I could sometimes draw on that. I do send press releases out in my role at Save the Children, but I don't just send a press release out. We tend to try to generate a bit of interest first in other ways, with a bit of video on social media, or perhaps a round of calls to people that we know to say that the release is coming and it's a good story, and that is its purpose. I don't think they're anything like as useful as they used to be, but I once sat on the Daily Mail news desk for a night in the days of paper, when things would be faxed through, and I measured the pile of press releases at the end of a one working day at the Daily Mail, and it was 7 feet high, even taller than me.
Yeah,
needle in the haystack.
My thought also is that, and Sean referenced this a few minutes ago, was the importance of the audience. So if something is quite well targeted, then it can work. But I agree with Sean completely that obviously social media platforms are much more important these days to perhaps try and make that connection and gain some interest, and then perhaps follow it up with a well-crafted press release once again with a headline or something that will grab the attention of whoever is picking it up, perhaps via email in any event. So it does need to be well-crafted.
Yeah, and I think listening to you guys, it sounds also as though the press release has changed, hasn't it? It's morphed into more of a marketing strategy, that actually what you're looking to do is provide a journalist with, here's a soundbite, or here's a piece of video, or here's some photographs, here's an infographic, so that you're, instead of it just being a press release, it's a more rounded story, if you like.
Yes, and we also make it more functional. So we call them, as often as not, spokesperson alert rather than press releases. And it's just to say, we've got this person in Yemen at that place that has just been bombed by the Saudis, and she's got a very dramatic story to tell. Would you like to speak to her? And that is our way of saying, there's been an airstrike, it's been horrible, but more than that, here's a way for you to do the story really well.
And also, James, I was
immediately telling the journalist that you've got a spokesperson available, and they're on site, and let's do this.
Exactly, and then the speed is everything in these situations, because there's a lot of competition for the space after an incident or a humanitarian disaster like the recent big bombing in the center of Beirut, and we were very intent on getting out there first, because we knew that if we did, lots of journalists would come to us first for the next few days, and we just lined up a series of stories that they could do. We didn't have as big an operation on the ground as some other organizations, because we're not huge in Lebanon, but we still managed to get more than our fair share of media coverage just by getting out there really fast.
And I spoke, James, just a few within the last week or so, to someone who spent most of his life in a television newsroom, and he was telling me that on occasions press releases or news, if you like, will emerge, and then when the media organization has gone back for a follow-up, whether it's an interview or the like, that organization wasn't ready. They couldn't provide someone perhaps for the morning radio show, because obviously radio news tends to be quite prominent at breakfast time, but they didn't have a spokesperson available before 9 or 10 o'clock in the day. So if you are going to make that connection with the media, you then need to be in a position where you can follow it through and make sure you've got your spokesperson available to step forward if necessary. Conversely, I'm also aware, once again, with one of the TV networks, I was hearing a story very recently of a tourist venue that has received above average publicity because they always made themselves available. As soon as, the tourism story came around, are we opening up again post-lockdown, et cetera, and when TV crews wanted to visit or journalists needed somebody on the telephone, they were always available. Hence, they were receiving perhaps above average exposure. It's fair to say that happens as well.
Yeah, great. A question here, directed at you, Sean, from Catherine Hunter. Catherine, thank you. If you don't read all your emails, what's the best way to grab your attention, assuming that there isn't time to give you a heads up before? Any tips on that, Sean?
Well, social media is one way. So I do keep a regular eye on my Twitter feed. So if you send me a direct message, that is one possibility. I look at LinkedIn less regularly during the day. So if you send me a message there, I might not see it until possibly the next day or that evening. But I suppose the best way is probably, if you can't get me, get one of my colleagues. So we do have a 24-hour press line at Save the Children. It's somebody will always answer the phone, and it doesn't need to be me necessarily for you to contact me about a story, and that would be the same for many other organizations. It doesn't matter where you start. If you start with somebody who can at least respond to your query and give you a quick answer about whether it's a story for them or not, that is what you need. You don't need necessarily the news editor or the director of communications or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
A point also I think worth making, James, is that certainly in the regional media, there have been sort of declining numbers of journalists in newsrooms across the country, especially over the past decade or so. So once again, when those news outlets are thinking ahead and doing their own planning, what are we going to have available for tomorrow or the next day or for this week's paper, perhaps in the case of a weekly product, they want to be sure that anything that they're sort of working on will have a result, that it will make. They don't have the staffing numbers to carry out investigations and research that has no product at the end of it. So once again, I think that press offices, communications teams, PR teams can help the media by making sure that they can deliver, so that if the journalist makes an inquiry, can they come back, one, with a swift response? If they can't help and it's a no-go, then say so quickly enough. If they can, then be ready to help and follow that organization through, so that the journalist, the media outlet, has a result at the end of it. Perhaps in television terms, that could be that they do get their 2-minute package for the 6 o'clock news or whatever it may be, because resources within the media have also declined dramatically in recent years.
And that comes back to the trust point that you boys were discussing a moment ago, doesn't it? A couple more questions quickly, and then I think we're going to move on, guys. There's a bunch of questions coming through, so we'll do the classic. We'll answer as many of these as we can. I know Sean, we're going to come back and do some more Q&A bits a bit later on as well. So please keep the questions coming in. Jodie Bell, has COVID made embargoed news irrelevant? Is there still a space for the embargo moving forward? What do you gents think to that?
Well, I would say yes, there is. COVID was all consuming for a long time, and then editors started to realize that people wanted to read about things other than COVID and wanted to see things other than COVID on their TV screens as well. So although COVID is still often the top story of the day, there's plenty of other stories there. And so I think there's a great opportunity for stories that have a completely different feel and a completely different angle. I was amazed by the success of something we did at Save the Children a couple of weeks ago called National Children's Gardening Week. We did this with Peppa Pig, and you couldn't wish for a bigger contrast between that story and the horrible deaths from COVID. So we got 10 parent influencers, and we gave them gardening sets, and they took pictures of their children using the gardening sets, and we got a huge amount of coverage on Instagram, and a reach in the hundreds of thousands. So that was an example of a campaign that was embargoed because we wanted to confine the coverage to 3 or 4 days to get maximum impact. And none of the influencers broke the embargo, and a few national papers picked up old-fashioned press release as well.
But Sean, can I just throw that back at you and ask you whether you think that on occasions you have to be cautious? Because once again, the journalists might be thinking, why is this organisation imposing an embargo? What's the point of this embargo? And from a journalistic point of view, I might be thinking, no, it's a good story, I'm going to run with this.
Journalists are still quite good at following embargoes. Sometimes they don't, because they make a mistake and they don't see it, or at least sometimes that's what they claim. It's quite rare for embargoes to be broken, but I think when you see an embargo, you realise that somebody's setting it for a particular reason.
Yeah.
But it's being done by all sorts of organisations with media operations, and I think it's enough of a convention for it not to arouse too many suspicions.
Yeah. And I also think it's fair to say on that point, James, with embargoes, that once again, I've spent a lot of my career in television newsrooms, and planning is so important. As I said a few moments ago, they want to know where they're going to be sending their crews, the day after tomorrow, or sending their journalists the day after tomorrow. So planning is important. So it does work for organisations to get on those planning diaries if they want their stories covered, to make sure that they're on that planning list when that's being considered. So, don't think that you're going to send a press release into a newsroom, a television newsroom, and suddenly get a response within the hour, because they want a little bit of planning, certainly in the regions.
There's a question here off the back of something Sean was talking about a moment ago. Amber has put, what about if you don't work in such fast-paced environment as Save the Children, where you don't have spokespeople on the ground as such, and instead you want to talk about research and reports published by your organisation? What's the best way to publicise these to journalists other than through a press release?
Well, I think if you're planning ahead with a report, and this is something we also do at Save the Children, we adopt a different set of tactics, really. We work out the angle in the report, and we try to make sure that the media team is involved at an early stage in the conception of the report writing, and we try to influence the way the report is presented so that it is newsworthy. And then if it is newsworthy, we can spot what sort of media outlets might be interested in the angle. So there's always a journalist for a story. I truly believe this. Just as there's always somebody out there for all of us, I also think there's always a journalist out there for one of our stories, and it might be a very technical one, and it might not get a massive audience. It might be that you end up talking to a blogger and getting them to share it for you because you can't get anybody else to pick it up. But it's surprising sometimes how a decent story, well presented, can start somewhere really obscure and still make it up to New Scientist or even one of the national papers from time to time. So I think it comes back down to spotting how to make it as newsworthy as possible. So it's got to be topical, it's got to be relevant to the audience that you're targeting, it's got to have something really unusual in it. And Chris has mentioned human interest. It might not necessarily work for you in all senses when you're talking about really technical research, but sometimes the researcher themselves can be the human interest in the story. And if it's somebody with a really unusual story in their own right, or who is unusually successful in their field for someone from their background, then that can often help you to pitch it and sell it.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. I think it's about identifying the angle, James. Identify the story.
Yeah. Those of you familiar with our media training courses might have just recognised Sean using the TRUTH acronym, which is something that we talk about a lot on the Media First course. It's an acronym that we created to help people remember what's newsworthy. So topical, relevant, unusual, human interest, and the missing T is trouble, which is either introducing but also solving, or just kind of agitating a conversation, if you like. So it doesn't necessarily have to be about introducing a negative. It could be solving a problem. Guys, loads and loads and loads of questions coming in. Please keep them coming. Really enjoying reading these, and we will try and get through them as much as possible. Chris, I'm not entirely sure that we're going to be joined by Louise. I'm just going to look to my right and see what Tomo is going to say. Tomo says that. So we might we might skip over Louise, and maybe she'd be able to join us a bit later on. But why don't we get a video off the ground and take a little break, and then come back, and you guys can carry on your conversation, and maybe we'll do a few more questions later on.
It's absolutely clear that there were patterns of behaviour in our organisation back in 2015 and in 2012 that were intolerable and yet were tolerated. And I do apologise deeply to the women who were affected. Our organisation let them down, and it must never happen again.
As a former chief executive of Save the Children, he faced complaints about inappropriate behaviour. He was accused of sending text messages to young female staff about how they looked and what they were wearing.
So there we are, a short video there illustrating Save the Children in our national news headlines as they were certainly a couple of years back. And Sean Ryan is still with me, I'm pleased to say. And Sean, in 2016, you joined Save the Children, as I understand it, 2 years ago. I think you became the Director of Media and Corporate Communications. Now, it was in January 2018, there was an attack, wasn't there, on a Save the Children premises in Afghanistan. 6 were left dead, more injured. Just tell us, presumably devastating and also high profile.
Yes, so I've had to get used to crisis communications quite quickly after joining Save the Children, and this terrible incident happened in a place called Jalalabad in Afghanistan, where Save the Children has a compound of people doing mainly work on education in that part of the country. And ISIS blew up a vehicle outside the front gate and then stormed the compound. A series of gunmen opened fire. 6 people were killed, and about 50 of our staff fled to the basement and were then trapped by fighting going on around them between the terrorists and the local military police. So I heard about this about 5:30 in the morning. We put out a press release at 6, which made the BBC early morning bulletins. We didn't have much information, just to say that the explosion had happened and that a gunfight was underway. And then we updated the information at 8 and 9 with news that people had been killed. But at 9 o'clock, our security director, global security director, said that because of the people in the basement, in the sort of safe room in the basement, he thought it would be a mistake to draw any more attention to the story, and we shouldn't put out any more press releases. And I said, well, if we do that, we'll just create a vacuum and people will fill it with speculation, but they won't stop reporting the story. But I had to defer to his judgment because it was a very sensitive security situation. Unfortunately, I was proved right, and sure enough, I got a call from the Wall Street Journal to say that they'd spotted on an ISIS-related website the claim that Save the Children had been attacked in Afghanistan because we've been evangelizing, in other words, trying to convert local people to Christianity. Completely untrue. All our staff in that office are Afghans and Muslims, but somehow this rumor had gone around, and the Wall Street Journal reporter said he was going to report this, and I pointed out that if he did report that Save the Children staff had been evangelizing, it would put us at risk in many other Muslim countries around the world. Nevertheless, he said he was going to write the story. So I had to ring somebody that I knew on the Wall Street Journal foreign desk, which I used to share an office with, fortunately. And I explained to him the position, and he immediately withdrew the story. So that was a narrow escape. But I think it shows the dangers for anyone who's facing crisis communications of creating a vacuum or letting a vacuum be created. Because if you establish yourself as the main story for the story, you're in control. And the minute you stop talking, stop putting anything out, that vacuum is going to be filled by information from other sources or by rumour and speculation, and that's when you can really run into trouble.
Yeah, and presumably, just to clarify that point, that in a sense that was your thinking with the initial press releases. You wanted to act as swiftly as possible.
Yes, I wanted to act as swiftly as possible, put out the information we had, and make sure that journalists were coming to us for updates. And when they started coming to us for updates and we were unable to release any more information, at that point they started to go elsewhere. And they were even calling the people who were trapped in the basement. So there was no question of creating less attention by stopping talking about it in London. The story carried on and we lost control of it.
And so the following month, February 2018, a former chief executive resigned from his position with another children's organisation. There've been allegations from female staff members that they've been subject to inappropriate behaviour during his time at Save the Children. And a former chief strategist with the charity had resigned from 2 other organisations after allegations against him. And then a charity commission investigation reported serious failures and mismanagement in the way allegations had been handled and questioned the workplace culture at Save the Children. So once again, you were really in the eye of media storms coming in your direction.
It was a very intense time, and thank you for re-traumatizing me by showing those cuttings and the voice of my chief executive apologizing before during the break there. What happened was that these people left the organization in 2015, and there were little stories about the reasons for their departure at the time. But then in 2018, the Times broke the story about sexual misconduct by Oxfam in Haiti, and suddenly the whole aid development sector was under scrutiny, and people inevitably returned to this rather tantalizing subject of the departures of 2 senior people, which had left a few questions unanswered, to put it mildly. So we found ourselves facing a barrage really of inquiries, and we got, I suppose, for about 6 weeks, really intense round of calls. There was one day when we had 8 separate hostile inquiries from different newspapers in the UK alone, but it was also a story of great international interest.
Can I ask you, Sean?
Tough going, yeah.
Can I ask you, Sean, then, did you feel there was anything you could do in those difficult circumstances to influence how Save the Children was being viewed by the wider audience?
Well, I did take the decision to carry on putting out the things that we were going to put out anyway during that time. So the positive stories that we put out actually got more space and attention than the negative stories when we analysed everything afterwards and looked at all the statistics. And I think that helped to limit the damage to our brand, because although people were aware that there was something wrong at Save the Children, they also remained aware of some of the good things that we are obviously doing around the world. Whereas Oxfam just put their head in a bunker, I felt, and were the passive recipients of a lot of hostile publicity and didn't really put things out, other things about other areas of activity in the way that we did. So that was one thing that we did well. One thing we did less well was that we hired a lawyer to protect the interests of the women who had brought complaints against these 2 executives, because they were being doorstepped by the Daily Mail. Not a pleasant experience when they made their complaints in confidence, of course. And in one case, the mother of one of the complainants was doorstepped at her farm in Kent by the Daily Mail. So we felt we needed a bit of extra protection from the tabloids. And the lawyer had worked with our then chairman on an attempt to fend off an investigation into Comic Relief, which he had co-founded by Panorama. And he was an aggressive lawyer, and he sent letters out to journalists, and some of them thought that that meant that we were trying to gag the media and prevent these stories from being published, when actually what we were trying to do, although it was easily open to interpretation, was make sure that what was being reported was accurate. So the letters would say, here are the facts, and here are the answers to your questions, which show that you've got the wrong information here. We hoped that would provide a bit more balance in the coverage. I suppose it did to some extent, but the upshot was that we were seen as very defensive, that we'd spent a lot of money on lawyers that should have been spent on other things, or it was taken from reserves, not programs from children. And I think it created long-term problems with our relationships with the reporters who were asking legitimate questions and then finding that their editors were receiving a legal letter. It's not something we would ever do again. It was something that we fell into for a period of a week or two at the time, and we've learned a lesson from that. Just to give you a sense of the type of misinformation that was flying around, though, I got one call from a broadsheet newspaper, a very respectable broadsheet newspaper, asking me whether it was true that one of our directors had been suspended for sexual misconduct. And when I looked into it, I saw that he just emailed his staff to say that he was taking a sabbatical. This was the source of the rumor. But the reason when I called him was that his mother was gravely ill and he just wanted to spend some time with his mother. So I had to explain that to the reporter from the broadsheet newspaper. And thankfully, he was someone I'd had a few dealings with before, and he believed me. And we kept that story out of the paper. But we did feel very much under bombardment, as many people do, of course, in a crisis when it is hard to control.
Yeah, because it is, isn't it? Those potentially negative, and what you're saying there, it wasn't potentially, it was negative situations and crisis management situations that will worry organizations. They do worry organizations, but from your experience and what you're saying there is that you're almost encouraging the communications teams for those organizations. They shouldn't disappear into their own bunkers. They still need to have their own profile and make sure they're being seen and heard and conveying the message of their particular organization.
Yes. So what I wanted to do at the time, and I think what I would definitely win the argument for doing if the same situation arose again, God forbid, was really to engage with our critics. So we were being advised for all sorts of reasons not to speak to the women who had brought complaints, not to speak to the people in a campaign who were championing their cause, and not to speak to the journalists in any depth, because you might just add fuel to the fire, was the thinking. But what I found when the lawyer went away was that I did meet the journalists. I had drinks with them and coffees with them and tried to put things a little bit more in perspective with them and tried to show them that we were being transparent and rather than trying to cover things up. And I just wish we had done that at an earlier stage. So my advice to anyone facing a similar situation in future is do engage with the critics. Try not to let the lawyers, who are very cautious, win all the arguments over the communications people, because sometimes it just doesn't work in the best interest of the organisation.
Yeah, it's interesting also, isn't it? Because mentioning the lawyers there, as you have, also raises the questions about internal communications within any organisations. Different branches of the same team need to come together on occasions and work things through, perhaps before going outside of their own brand or their own organisation.
Yeah, and if you're in a charity, then you're surrounded by people who are there because they believe in a job with social purpose, and they are essentially good people doing a decent job, and they just couldn't quite cope with the idea of being attacked by the Daily Mail day after day after day. It was very bruising. So some of the internal communications was intended to just reassure people and just buoy people up and give them a sense that that certain things that were being reported were going to be investigated by the Charity Commission, and we would be cooperating fully with the Charity Commission, of course. And some of the other information that was flying around was not true. We hoped that we would keep staff on board that way, and we also had a big job to do in communicating with stakeholders, our donors, for example, both in government and in some of the big corporates who wanted all the reassurance.
Excellent. And I know James has come back in. Can I just ask you one further question before James takes over for a moment or two? Can we mention influencers, Sean? Those who can affect the habits or actions of others through their following, very often on social media platforms. Can organisations such as yours use them? And is there a risk if a brand or an organisation sort of ties itself to that third party?
Yes, well, I'm a big believer in using influencers, and I use a lot, but I always check them out. And if there's anything they've said in the past that was racist, misogynistic, homophobic, obviously we don't go anywhere near them. And it's, it doesn't take too long to check people out. So to give you a couple of examples, we do an annual event called Christmas Jumper Day, which raises several £1 million a year, and it's one of our big fundraising events. We did it slightly differently in 2019, the last chance before the pandemic. We invited 83 influencers to a drop-in where we gave them sweaters and lessons in upcycling old Christmas jumpers so that it was all environmentally friendly. And those 83 influencers all ran things in the run-up to Christmas, and we got over 300 Instagram stories and a reach of over 3 million, which is spectacular. And sometimes we just choose an individual influencer that we think we can work well with. So Bryony Gordon was one that we worked with a couple of years ago. She's a Telegraph columnist and a mental health campaigner and an author, and an all-round good person. We took her to Uganda and we put her in with some refugees from fighting in South Sudan, and she was doing extraordinarily intense interviews with some of the mothers of children about what they'd been through to get there and how they saw their life in the refugee camp and their prospects for the future. And Bryony ran 33 stories during her brief few days in Uganda on Instagram, and again, an enormous reach. And she did a podcast, and she wrote a column in the Daily Telegraph, and you couldn't ask for much more than that.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Okay, James.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I just thought it was a pertinent time to jump in. There's a question here from Sam Dowling, who says, as a comms professional, ex-journalist, she recognises the frustration at being proved right after the fact, rehandling and handling of a crisis comm situation. Any top tips on influencing or winning over C-suite on the media handling approach? Sean, how have you found that over the last few years?
Well, I suppose with the benefit of my experience, I could now say, this is what we tried last time, this is why it didn't work, this is what we should try this time. And if anyone is out there wanting to refer to the lessons to be learned from Oxfam's experience and my experience and the experience of many others in our sector where the sexual misconduct scandal has spread, including the World Health Organization and various other parts of the United Nations, then I think you can say to your people internally, as a comms professional, here's what I've observed in similar organizations about their handling. Here are the lessons they think they've learned and that they're willing to be quite open about. And so we can't make the same mistakes. Let's not make the same mistakes. Let's do it like this. And if you can get the ear of your chief executive, my experience is that will then filter down, and I would just be bold and go right in there, go straight to the top and say, this is the way we need to handle it. And if he accepts the argument, you'll find that there's much less disagreement with the way you're handling things.
Yeah. And if you need, even if you're not in charity sector, but if you need some other case studies and examples, do check out the blogs on our website, on the Media First website. Adam, who is our content editor, does a lot of blogs on case studies, the way the crisis have been handled, what the lessons that we can learn from that. So go and have a delve into that if that's going to be helpful. What did I have here? Where was I going? Sam Dowling was someone whose question I thought was really interesting. Sam asked, where's the line between ingratiating and generally raising a new perspective? And how much are you influenced by reader perspective / story merit?
I've been very influenced by it as an editor because the analytics give you amazingly rich information about how well a story is doing in terms of its engagement and just the number of hits. So you can tell how many people are reading a story, how long they spend on it, and what the total amount of time commanded by that story is. So it's pretty clear what is working and what is not working. And as I said earlier, I don't regard it, I don't really think of people as ingratiating themselves. I just think they've got a story and they want to give it to me, and I might or might not want to accept it. And I will use the data from analytics as part of the judgment I make on whether to accept a story, because I'll remember how we did with the last similar story and whether we want to repeat that. And if the last similar story was a great success, I'm much more likely to take it. And that's one of the criteria that are increasingly used in newspapers. I mean, I was in the Wall Street Journal newsroom in New York not that long ago, and the whole of one wall is given over to a massive board showing what people are reading right now at this minute, so you can see live whether a story is working or not. And that's why stories appear on the website, move up the website, move down the website, and disappear from the website if they're not being read. We are incredibly sensitive now to readers' responses, and people talk about clickbait and being a corrupting influence on news judgment. There is an element of that, but I think there's also a strong element that sometimes stories take you by surprise, and people are much more interested than you thought they might be.
There's a couple of questions here relating to clickbait. Guys, we are fast running out of time, though. We've got about 3 minutes left. And I would like to get Louise on, if we could, if she's about. How are we doing? I think Louise is here. Fabulous. Hi, Louise.
Hiya.
Chris, can I hand over to you, and can you have a little chat with Louise? I'd just like to get her insight into how she's found things from her charity perspective.
Yeah.
And then we'll wrap up, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice to see you, Louise. And just to remind anyone who's with us, Louise is a senior media officer with the animal welfare charity Blue Cross. Nice to see you, Louise. And we've been talking with Sean there about relationships between, once again, an organisation in the charity sector and the media. What's your approach, Louise?
Well, it varies, of course, with different journalists and different audiences, but we tend to, with our local rehoming centres, build really close relationships, and the ideal way to get those contacts is to invite them to meet you in person. I think once you've met face to face, that's a kind of a really good way for them to remember you, and then when you do pick up the phone to them, they're kind of like, oh yeah, we met at the centre. Also, just find out which journalists have pets, because you're more likely to kind of engage them with your stories if they have that animal bond themselves. And of course, just scour the papers for journalists writing about stories to do with animals and relevant things that you can pitch to.
And as well as your senior team, because you have different locations and sites across the country, you also look to train and ensure that you have a range of spokespeople in different parts of the country.
That's exactly right, because if you get somebody from BBC Radio Humberside, they're not really going to want somebody from London. They're going to want somebody from Grimsby, where we have an animal hospital. So just to make sure that those guys are confident. I think one of the main fears for people that I've trained with Media First is that they're going to say the wrong thing, but they're never going to say the wrong thing, because they are the experts, and TV presenters and radio presenters are not experts in veterinary or animal behaviour. So it's just building confidence in them, I think. And so to have that range across the country has been brilliant. And we're starting to do a bit of training in-house now as well, with sort of more junior members. And it's really a lot of building confidence.
And do they value that training? And what feedback do they give you when they take on from training?
Yeah, they really do. They really enjoy it. I think beforehand we have a kind of little talk about what they want out of the sessions, and afterwards what they found useful. And every single time bridging has been so useful to them. Just the fact that they can control the interview, they don't have to answer directly every single question that's asked of them. And also the little secret that I tell them, that bridging works in personal life too.
Just to explain to anyone with us who's unaware of that, bridging is all about steering and directing the route of a conversation. Absolutely. And what tips or what advice, Louise, would you give perhaps to organisations who might be listening to us now, and they might be considering the merits of media training, but perhaps they've got to try and get it signed off by the financial director? What are your thoughts there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's why we're doing a bit in-house, because if you're trying to train up lots and lots of people, it can add up. But I think the benefits, particularly for senior people, your CEO, your director team, is essential. It's absolutely essential to get them properly trained, and not just once, have them refresher sessions every year or so. And if you've got something coming up that's got potential issues with it, that Sean was just saying about that situation that Save the Children were in, I mean, that is vital to have people media trained and confident in talking to the media, and not being shy or hiding from the media if something difficult arises.
Yeah, and is it fair to say also that having an awareness of the media and the training that we've just spoken about there, that it has had an impact on the way Blue Cross as a charity is viewed by the wider audience?
Yes, I think so. I think as well it's the sort of theories and stuff behind how the press team works and how you get a story and what journalists are interested in and the kind of different assets you need for a story. I think, and the amount of work and support we give to our spokespeople before they do an interview. They didn't know that we would give them a full briefing. They didn't know that we'd offer a kind of practice run-through session, that we come up with the key messages, we come up with the quotes for them. I think they hadn't really realised how media works. And I think it's really interesting when you're in this bubble of media that you kind of sometimes forget that people that are animal behaviourists, animal welfare assistants, they have no idea how it works. And it's just completely eye-opening for them.
But ultimately, as you said a moment ago, they are the experts. They know the stories and they can tell those stories.
Exactly,
Excellent.
they're the experts.
Yeah. Good to see you again, Louise. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you.
James.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think we are out of time. So let me just say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Chris, to Louise, to Sean. Thank you also to my team here and everybody kind of behind the scenes who have helped to pull this second webinar together. A lot of work has gone into it behind the scenes, so really appreciate that, guys. And of course, thank you to all of you guys for attending and joining and throwing loads of questions our way. We're going to take those offline and do our best to get through those and figure out a way that we can answer those. So keep an eye out on your emails and we'll make sure that you get those answered somehow. So Chris, Sean, Louise, thank you very much, guys. Take care all.
Thank you.